everyone, my name is Josh and this is WHIMS School and Interesting Musings, and today I'm going to be talking about episode 5 of the television series Dead Ringers. And at the end of the last episode, we had a very explosive argument where a couple of people walked out. It was on the eve of, it was essentially Beverly and Eliot's birthdays, and their parents came over to visit, and there was this entire storyline with the mum basically not feeling like she adjusted to childhood all that well. But then there's also the extra dark subject of, did Eliot actually kill a homeless person, or was it all in her imagination, her drug-addled imagination? And of course, what's going to happen to Beverly and Genevieve after Genevieve finds out through a casual slip of the tongue from Eliot that her first kiss with the woman that she loved didn't turn out to be the kiss from the woman that she loved that she hoped for, and it turns out that she was actually kissing her girlfriend's identical twin sister. And that, to me, really is where the episode really kind of gives itself a bit of a pat on the back, because I do feel like this particular revelation was going to happen. For those of you who've seen the original film, we knew that this was eventually going to take place. But what's very interesting is it really does create a very interesting scenario where it does slightly hint at what's to come throughout the course of the series. And when I get to the series finale, I'll be talking about that. But first we have to talk about this episode. So what this episode basically begins as is it kind of has a flash forward where Eliot is in her surgical gown. She's in her surgical gear in a car, in sort of like the passenger seat of a car, and she has blood all over her face, like little lines of blood on her face. She has all sorts of different things going on. And then she sees a man who later turns out to be Silas, who is a biographer who's meant to be writing a puff piece on the Mantle twins, walking out of the of this large, luxurious manor house. And Eliot basically follows him, heavily pregnant, and looking in the passenger seat directly at Eliot, completely and utterly ashamed and dismissive of her, and then she walks back into the house. And this leads, Eliot back into another one of her screaming matches where she just basically takes everything out on the dashboard and she basically goes totally insane. And Silas is just sitting there going, he's basically waiting for her to have her tantrum, and then he just basically says in a very comedic fashion, "Are you done now?" and I love that opening because it really does hint to you what could potentially be coming much later on. And I really do think this episode is really great because it takes a classic scene from the original Dead Ringers, which is the scene where Beverly, in his a drug-induced state, decides to go into work and practice surgery on a woman who is trying to get pregnant, but sadly something goes wrong when he decides to use his newly developed and newly commissioned surgical instruments, which he says are used for working on mutant women. And I think that's something that really is important about this particular episode, is you really do get this impression that in the original Dead Ringers, it was more about men trying to create and trying to control something that's literally out of their comfort zone, whereas with this particular version, it's a very much more female-orientated version, because of course these women are actually trying to take women in a different direction. They're trying to basically say, we can cure the menopause, we can, make women fertile, we can deliver babies that are of exceptional health, and we can actually prevent all sorts of different things through our surgical techniques. But in this particular instance, Eliot and Beverly are commissioned by a wealthy bachelor and the Parkers to basically deliver the triplets or the quadruplets of a very well-known, successful but retired surgical gynecological doctor whose daughter is giving birth to quadruplets. And the entire episode basically takes its inspiration from kind of like a gothic horror story, or a kind of it feels almost like it's The Beguiled, but told from the point of view of these very kind of stiff upper lip, very kind of old-fashioned women who own this house. And it really kind of gives me that impression. It gives me that impression of sort of like being a homage to The Beguiled or some other kind of, very dark psychological story. And it really is actually really intelligently photographed. The way this particular episode is directed, particularly the way they use lighting, the way they use, distant shots. There's this one scene where Beverly is going to a room in her nightgown, and she enters this room and she sees a black woman in the far distance, basically sitting down, and she delivers this entire monologue about a girl who was a slave, who was essentially forced to give up her child and basically be rejected the right of motherhood because she was basically a slave and she didn't have that right because of white slavers in those particular days. And it's a really intelligently written monologue. The use of repetition, the use of the character getting closer and closer and closer really adds a certain level of madness and insanity to things. But it also goes to show that Beverly in herself isn't in a good place either. It's really kind of reaffirming that sense of doubt that she has, in the sense of, can she be a good mother? Can she deal with the fact that she can do this stuff, but then also do her job at the same time of being a good gynecological professor and a good gynecological surgeon? So there's a lot of things going on that are reaffirmed and carried over from this particular episode. And from the previous episode where there was that slight doubt of motherhood and that idea of motherhood creeping in, and is there that little bit of delayed shock where you're thinking to yourself, oh my god, what if I'm not cut out for this kind of thing? It's been reaffirmed through this sequence, and it's very well done. It feels like it should be in the television series of Hannibal, with the way it's shot and the way it's composed, where it's mostly in darkness, but then there's this one figure and it's told in a very surrealistic way. But it really does add a lot of insight into the sorts of privileges that people like Beverly Mantle do have, which is that they do have the opportunity to prove themselves now. They can, do this stuff, whereas racism is something that still is a constant in America, even till to this day, with things like police brutality. But I digress, that's a subject for another video. But I do feel like that's something that really is interestingly brought to the table in this particular episode. But what I think is really compelling about this episode is Elliot is still going off the rails, but what I really hate about this episode, and what really makes, the heartache and the drama all that much more real, is that essentially the Mantle twins are on the rocks. They're in this position where Beverly is now carrying a child. She's carrying a child for their on her own at this point. She doesn't have anybody with her. She now has to do this job of carrying this child to term, but then she's also got to do her job as a gynecologist at the Mantle Parker practice. So she's got a lot to do, and I really do like the fact that she really does highlight I think it's very important that at the end of this episode she says something very important, where she is getting ready to accept her big award. And she basically says, before they go off to the award ceremony, to Genevieve, why are people saying that they have to do all this stuff for me, that they've given up stuff for me? Like, I'm literally carrying a child here. Like, I'm the one who has to give up a lot of things for other people. I have to literally give up my body for this child. I have to basically give up my entire freedom just so I can, carry this child to term. And I really do like the fact that there was almost that hint that she wanted to say, why are people always saying this stuff like, they're doing this stuff for me, when in reality I'm the one who's doing the heavy lifting. I'm the one who's carrying the child. I'm the one who has to, make sure that I'm feeding this child properly and making sure this child looks after. And they're in my belly. They're actually, growing inside me. So why are people always saying that they're doing this for me, when in reality I'm doing so much more? And it really is a very powerful moment. It really shows a very tragic layer to Beverly's character. But Beverly was always a tragic character. Even if we look at the original 1988 film starring Jeremy Irons, he was always portrayed with a certain tragic edge to his character, because he was the youngest, he was the more fragile, he was the more vulnerable twin of the two, whereas Elliot was more controlled. He was more, assured of himself. He was more, suave and sophisticated and kind of a bit manipulative, but that's what made him charming. Whereas it's the other way round, it seems, where, Beverly seems to have a life together until she doesn't, and then of course Elliot is the one who starts to go on the downward spiral. During the iconic surgery scene, and I say iconic in the sense that it's in reference to the original. In this one, it is still also really quite memorable in the sense that they get the retired surgeon into the practice, into the surgery room to make the first cut on his daughter's um, C-section. And it really kind of makes me think this is actually quite twisted and messed up. And there's even a line that he says during a dinner where certain practices have changed, and it's a really twisted monologue. I can't really remember it word for word, but I do feel like that's one of those moments where I feel like this episode really does show that it really has changed a lot for gynecology. I mean, literally, and it's kind of almost highlighted, and you're given a reminder in the monologue that the woman gives in the darkened room, where she basically says there was no anesthetic, there was no way of making sure that she could be peacefully sedated. She had to endure the pain of childbirth. She had to endure the pain of a C-section without anyone there by her side. Like, her family was there, but then of course she didn't have many families because she just came over as a slave on her own, and she had to do this job. She had to basically be this person all on her own without anyone to protect her. And the white people, the people who owned her, basically disowned her and said, she was she got herself into trouble again, and she needs to take care of the child on her own. And that really is quite dark and disturbing, and it's kind of almost magnified by the father's monologue about how much the gynecological practice has changed, and how uncaring and how almost sociopathic and cold and clinical the practice of gynecology was, and how these men were examining these women like they were particles on a petri dish. And it really goes to show that now that practice has changed. But what I really hate about this episode is, again, I'm going back to Rebecca Parker, in the sense that even though she probably has every right to call him out on the stuff that he said to Beverly in the previous evening at the dinner, it was kind of chilling that she basically didn't take responsibility for the fact that they almost killed a woman having given birth to these quadruplets. But it wasn't actually the birthing that's the problem. In fact, Beverly is literally the star of the show. She's the one who delivers the babies. She's the one who's in control of that situation. And all Elliot has to do is stand by and do the sewing and sew her up. But something in her, whether it's the memory of seeing Genevieve and Beverly together, or it's her basically thinking about the time when she pushed that homeless person off the rooftop, off the balcony, she begins to go quite mad again. She begins to go quite unhinged. So she ends up, making an incision accidentally on the woman, and she ends up bleeding out, and the woman almost dies. But what's very interesting to me is that Rebecca Parker doesn't seem to acknowledge the fact that a person nearly died because of your company. And that's something that I really hated about the opioid crisis storyline, is she doesn't seem to care that her family has been responsible for the deaths of millions of people. And I really do hate that aspect about corporate life, especially corporate characters in American films and in American stories, because they always feel like they always shrug it off and say, "Oh, it isn't a big deal. Like, it's a mild setback," and things like that. And I'm just thinking, you're talking about people's lives, people who have literally, given their lives to you to do this experimentary drug, or whatever it is, whatever trial, whatever surgery, whatever big thing they're doing, they're testing out for you. They're putting their lives on the line to make sure this goes well for you. And if it doesn't, they lose their lives or they get horrifically sick. So the fact that she literally has this very blasé attitude and says, "Oh, well, you can say whatever the hell you want, but I can definitely say that I was totally in the right in doing this," it really makes me angry, and it really kind of makes me think, even if she took responsibility, she still hasn't taken responsibility for the things she did in the past. And I feel like that's very angry. That made me really angry, because again, it's that RoboCop character of Dick in the boardroom, when he says the 209 killing a man during a practice trial was, just a glitch. It really makes me angry when people like that really just kind of shrug off responsibility and say, "Oh, it wasn't my fault, it was just a glitch." And I'm just thinking to myself, what is your fault? You designed the creature to be this way, or you oversaw its manufacturing and its design. So why you immediately shrug off responsibility? But that's like everybody in life. That's like all celebrities who find themselves under fire for doing something controversial. They'll always shrug off the responsibility and say, it wasn't me, I was drunk, or it wasn't me, I was, going through a difficult rough patch and things like that. And it's really not very nice to hear that, you're basically saying that, but then again, you're also, in saying you're, but in almost taking responsibility, almost you kind of are almost minimizing the victim's role as someone who's been hurt and been damaged. So I feel like that's something that I really didn't like about the character of Parker, and it really kind of comes into play in the final episode of the series, which I really do think is a very interesting point, which I do want to discuss with people as soon as I get it filmed and written. But I do think she is a very dark character, and I do feel like whenever I hear one of her monologues, I feel like I want to roll my eyes, because essentially it's the same thing. It's people not taking responsibility for what's happened and just kind of letting stuff go and not really kind of taking into account the fact that this horrible thing happened. Yes, her father was in the surgery room when she made the first incision, but he wasn't responsible for her getting a blood clot or her getting a heavy bleed out. It was Eliot, and of course they do the right thing, they get rid of Eliot, but she admits that Eliot was her favourite person out of the Mantle twins, and I really do think that's an incredible development in the episode, and it really does kind of come full circle. Another storyline that I want to talk about is the storyline with the writer, who is named Silas. He basically is charged by Rebecca to write an article on the Mantle twins. They sent on the Mantle twins. They basically are an interesting inclusion into the world of medicine, and he basically needs to write a puff piece on them. So he follows them around. He goes to this particular excursion where they go to this manor house, and they basically talk a lot. And he essentially is one of those people who could very easily be a bad person. And again, this is another point where I feel like Rebecca Parker as a character really kind of irks me. She's actually one of my least favourite characters in the entire show, because when she calls him at the very end of the episode and says, I haven't written a word in many years and many months, so I literally have run dry and I feel lost, and she says, good, well, stay lost. And I thought, she's so cold and unfeeling and really kind of, she doesn't give a shit, despite the fact that she's giving her money to various different organisations and various different causes. But she'll happily champion things like, oh yeah, this woman held a dead baby in her arms, what have you done for your life? And I really do kind of hate that, and I really just wanted this character to get either arrested or to... I even went through the extreme of, imagine if she just got run over by a bus. Like, that would have been a real, what the fuck moment, but I would have at least thought, well, karma keeps receipts, like that's one of those things where I was actually kind of hoping that she would get, found out, or she would get, taken to task for a lot of the things that she's done. But she does something in the last episode which I feel like that's going to be an interesting discussion point, and that's really going to push her character to the nth degree. And I really do feel like this episode is really interesting because it really does talk about how much should a company be held responsible for something that another person does. Like, say, for example, I hate to be lifting stuff out of popular culture, but the whole entire idea behind the Disney debacle and the Marvel debacle with Jonathan Majors is a very interesting real life example of this, where how much are we going to how much is going to be pinned on Disney for doing this, and how much is going to be pinned on the star for the things that he's done. And I think that's something that this episode explores very well, with how much you can put off on the company, how much you can put off on the Mantle twins. But in many ways, Rebecca is still a monster. She still is a terrible person. She still has done terrible things. Her organisation, her very name, is literally associated with murdering people, destroying lives, but she just kind of shrugs it off and says, well, it was a minor setback for me. And she literally has a go at Beverly in the previous episode for essentially bringing up a lot of good points, like, oh yeah, it must be absolutely fun to have pig guts thrown on you, and being told that you're being associated with a murder and you'll burn in hell and things like And I thought, that must be absolutely fun. And then she goes, why don't you just do something, Beverly, and shut the F up and do your effing job? And I thought, how dare you? I'd have actually, I'd have actually just torn off my jacket and I'd have just said, shove your job up your backside. I'm leaving, because honestly, that really made me angry. And I literally had a moment where I had to pause the episode. But yeah, this character's a piece of shit. I really don't like her. And I feel like, I hope if they are going to do a second season, I hope they do kind of show her a little bit of karmic justice for, doing the things that she's done, because she does something quite shady at the very end of the episode as well. Like he does a lot of that stuff. She does that speech again. Like, she does all these speeches. Don't get me wrong, the actress is good, and I feel like she does a very good job of making me hate Rebecca so much. But what's very interesting is that I don't want to keep hating this character. I don't want to keep, saying that, oh, I hope this character, gets punished for something. But then again, that's a sign of good writing. If you don't see the actress, you see the character when you watch that particular performance. It goes to show that the writers are doing a good job. But this episode was really good. And I just want to know, what did you think of this episode? Did you think it was good, or did you think it was a step down from the previous episodes? And what will this mean going into the finale? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And that's all for now. I've been Josh with Whimsical and Interesting Musings. Take care. Bye bye for now.